Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, ready to dig into some Cold War intrigue. Today we're breaking down Salami tactics, how the Soviet Union basically sliced and diced their way to control in Eastern Europe after World War II.
And you want to understand not just the how, but the lasting impact, right? The ripples it sent across the global chessboard.
Exactly. We've got some really interesting sources to unpack here, like excerpts from a history podcast designed for IB students. But don't worry, we're going to skip the dry textbook stuff and get right to the good stuff.
Well, speaking of good stuff, the term salami tactics itself, it comes from Matyas Rákosi, a Hungarian communist leader who saw firsthand how Stalin orchestrated this whole thing.
Oh, so he had a front row seat to this whole power play.
He did,
Right.
which makes his use of the term salami all the more interesting.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. The Soviets after World War II, they weren't exactly subtle about wanting to expand their influence, were they?
No, not exactly. But instead of this outright invasion, imagine like a big layered cake, right? Each layer representing a different political faction in these war-torn Eastern European countries.
Okay, I'm following you.
Stalin, he wanted the whole cake total control, but instead of just grabbing the whole thing at once, he went about meticulously, slicing away these opposing layers one by one until only his chosen flavor remained.
Clever analogy. Sneaky, but clever. So this cake slicing, it had to start somewhere. Where did they even begin with these salami tactics?
Well, stage one was all about appearances, a classic case of hide in plain sight. The Soviets would create these broad alliances, bringing together different political groups under the banner of anti-fascism. On the surface, it seemed like genuine unity. Understandable, right? After years of brutal conflict.
Yeah, makes sense. We all hate the Nazis. Let's be friends. I mean, who wouldn't want to join hands and sing Kumbaya at that point? But knowing what we know about Stalin, I'm guessing those were all friends here.
Yeah.
Vibes didn't last long.
You got it. Stage two is where those slices start to disappear. See, those non-communist groups within the coalition, suddenly they find themselves losing influence, sidelined, discredited, sometimes even meeting far worse fates, unfortunately. It was a systematic removal of any potential opposition.
Wow. And this is where those baggage-trained leaders come into play, right?
Yeah.
I've come across that term, but to be honest, I wouldn't mind a little refresher.
Absolutely. Picture this. Stalin's got this whole train, right, filled with these loyal, Moscow-trained individuals ready to be installed in positions of power across Eastern Europe.
Like a whole train car of puppets ready to be deployed.
Well, they weren't just figureheads. They were his trusted lieutenants. Think Bolesław Bierut in Poland, Georgy Dimitrov in Bulgaria. These were individuals strategically placed to make sure these nations fell in line with Soviet interests.
So their allegiance was to Moscow, not necessarily to the people they were supposedly representing. Talk about a conflict of interest.
Exactly. And they were ruthless. We're talking rigged elections, suppression of any remaining opposition parties, and of course there were those infamous secret police networks, a terrifying reality for anyone who dared to even question this new order.
It's crazy to think about, These countries, they just escaped the horrors of Nazi occupation, and they find themselves trapped in another form of authoritarianism. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a hostile takeover disguised as liberation. And in the source material you sent, there's this particularly awful example that really highlights the 1947 elections in Poland.
A chilling illustration indeed.
So Poland, 1947, we've got Stanisław Mikołajczyk, leader of the Polish Peasant Party, a non-communist, and he's actually standing up to the Soviets, trying to, keep them honest.
And representing a genuine threat to their plans. But don't forget, his party, they were popular, they advocated for an independent Poland, an idea that definitely clashed with those Soviet plans for, shall we say, a more aligned Eastern Europe.
Right. So how did the Soviets handle this threat? Did they, let the democratic process play out? I think we both know the answer to that.
Yeah, not quite a level playing field, to put it mildly. These elections, they were supposed to be this shining example of democracy in action, right? But reality was a lot darker.
Go on. I'm on the edge of my seat.
Mikulášik's party, they faced an uphill battle from the start. Nearly 250 of their candidates were just straight up disqualified, some on the most ridiculous charges you can imagine. And it gets worse. 149 members of his party were arrested, and tragically, 18 of them were murdered during the campaign.
Oh, man, that's brutal. Just eliminating the competition, literally.
It's a horrifying thought, really. But they weren't done. They also removed, get this, 1 million voters, 1 million, who supported Mikulášik's peasant party from the electoral rolls. just wipe them off the list. The historian Desmond Donnelly, he called the election results unsurprising in these appalling circumstances of intimidation. No kidding.
It's heartbreaking. These people, the Polish people, they endured so much, and here they are, being denied the right to choose their own leaders. Makes you wonder, why even bother holding an election at all? It's a charade. It's a total sham.
And that's the genius, the awful genius, of these salami tactics. They could maintain this facade of legitimacy while crushing any real opposition.
Right, a thin veneer of democracy, barely even trying to hide it.
And if anyone called them out on it, the Soviets always had this handy little justification. The Yalta Agreement.
Hold on, Yalta. The agreement where the Allied leaders, including Stalin, shook hands and agreed to allow free and fair elections in post-war Europe. That Yalta.
That's the one. See, the Soviets, they were masters of twisting the narrative. They claimed that these were just defensive moves necessary to prevent Western expansionism. They made their power grabs sound like some noble act of self-preservation.
Right, because protecting their interests trumps any other country's right to exist, apparently. It's just amazing to me how this same events can be interpreted in such drastically different ways. And that's something that comes up a lot in the stuff you shared. Like, you've got these Orthodox historians, the George Kennan school of thought. They saw Soviet actions as this calculated strategy to expand their power, which makes sense, right? That view, it really shaped the West's Cold War policy of containment. But then, on the other hand, you've got the revisionists like William Appleman Williams, and they argued that Stalin was more pragmatic, more focused on, securing his borders after the devastation of World War II.
It wasn't some grand scheme for world domination, just basic self-interest.
Exactly. And it's not always about picking sides, right? Then you have the post-revisionists, and they're over here saying, well, it's probably a bit of both.
A blend of security concerns and good old-fashioned opportunism.
Right, a very messy historical cocktail. But before we disappear down that rabbit hole of historical debate, let's get back to those Soviet control mechanisms, those strings they were pulling to keep Eastern Europe in line. Because it wasn't just about rigging elections and silencing critics, right?
Absolutely not. They were playing a long game. They wove this web of control that went way beyond just politics. Think about it. They had their puppet leaders in place, but to really lock it down, they needed to control everything. Economies, societies, the whole shebang.
So they baked a few more cakes, just to be sure.
Kind of. We can think about it as these different strands, right? You've got the state police and their vast security networks, which we've talked about. Those were instrumental in just creating this atmosphere of fear. Like you said earlier, Big Brother was always watching.
Yeah, not exactly the kind of roommate you want. But even with all that fear, control can slip. What else did they use to bind these nations so tightly to Moscow?
Well, that's where COMECON comes, in the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Now, on the surface, this thing might seem, benign, maybe even helpful, right? It promoted economic cooperation between the Soviet-controlled nations. Sounds reasonable enough.
Yeah, kind of like a proto-European Union, right?
Exactly. But in reality, it was a way for them to integrate these Eastern European economies with the Soviet Union, making them totally dependent on Moscow. They controlled resources, industrial output, basically making sure that these nations served Soviet interests first and foremost.
Man, talk about a raw deal. They escape one empire, and they walk right into the clutches of another. It's like economic exploitation masquerading as cooperation.
And then there's the most obvious, the most visible strand in this whole web of control, the Red Army. They were everywhere in Eastern Europe, a constant reminder of, who was really in charge. It wasn't just about liberating these nations from fascism anymore. It was about preventing any challenges to their new authority. The Iron Curtain, it wasn't just a clever metaphor. It was backed up by some serious firepower.
It's kind of chilling how fast that post-war optimism just evaporated. One minute, everyone's celebrating victory, and the next, the lines are being redrawn and this whole new conflict is brewing. I'm reminded of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, In 1946, he said, "From Stettin, the Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Talk about ominous.
It was a warning shot, for sure, a recognition that the dream of a united and peaceful Europe, that was fading fast. And the Soviets' actions in Eastern Europe, their use of the salami tactics, it played a huge role in that breakdown. It's like the slow-burning fuse, just steadily leading towards the Cold War.
And how did the West react? The U.S., Britain, were they just caught flat-footed, or did they try to push back against this Soviet power grab?
It took a while to really sink in. The West, they just fought side by side with the Soviets. There were these agreements in place, Yalta and all that. The hope for some kind of post-war cooperation, that was real. Seeing it all fall apart piece by piece, it was tough to swallow.
Like finding out that a friend you trusted has been lying to your face the whole time.
Exactly. And those Yalta agreements, those weren't just some casual handshake deal. It was supposed to be this new world order where nations got to decide their own fate, and the Soviets just tossed it aside. It was infuriating. But it also forced the West to face a pretty scary reality. The Soviets, they weren't playing by the same rules.
So what could they even do about it? I mean, starting another war after the devastation of World War II, that wasn't an option, right?
It's a real dilemma. And this is where those different historical takes we talked about, they get really interesting. Like the realists, guys like Melvin Leffler, they say that this whole clash between the Soviets and the West, it was kind of inevitable. The Soviets had been through hell and back during the war. They wanted a buffer zone, a ring of friendly nations around them to prevent another invasion. Makes sense, right?
Well, from a certain point of view, sure, we've been burned before, got to protect ourselves. But securing your own borders by sacrificing everyone else's freedom, that's a pretty slippery slope.
You got it. And for the West, this wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about principles. They had to stand up for democracy, even as the Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. It felt like a betrayal of everything they had fought for.
So you've got this powder keg, right? Security concerns clashing with ideals, broken promises leading to mistrust, and this constant fear that one wrong move could trigger another global conflict. It's no wonder that alliance fell apart. That Iron Curtain speech, it wasn't just words. It was the realization that the world had fractured.
A division that would shape everything for decades. It's easy now to look back and say, well, the Cold War was bound to happen, but history is messy. Both sides made choices that brought them to that point.
Which makes you wonder, could things have gone differently? Was there another way, a path that didn't lead to a divided world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Did those salami slices, that slow erosion of freedom, did they actually prevent another war? Or did they just create a whole new set of problems for the world to deal with? It's a debate that's still going on.
What we do know is that this salami slicing, it left a mark. The Cold War might be over, but those tensions, the struggle for power, the fight for freedom, we're still seeing those playing out all over the world today.
And that's why it's so important to understand this stuff. If we can recognize the tactics, the motives, the dangers of unchecked power, maybe, just maybe, we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
It's a thought-provoking way to wrap things up. So, to our listener, we've really dug into these salami tactics, the methods, the players, the whole historical context. Now it's your turn. What sticks with you from this deep dive? What lessons can we take from this whole Soviet playbook and how the West responded as we try to navigate our own complex world today?
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.